Hey folks, Richard Ames here again with another video on digital audio workstation performance. And today I'm going to be discussing one of the most misunderstood elements of DAW performance, and that's the difference between real-time performance and CPU performance. I've encountered countless numbers of folks who say something along the lines of, I just got this dual Xeon Beast machine with 16 cores per processor and it's off the charts on the CPU benchmarks, but my buddy's measly 4-core i7 can run more virtual instruments at lower latency and with more plugins across the entire project. How can that possibly be? Well, the answer lies in the difference between real-time performance and CPU performance. Rest assured that that dual Xeon Beast machine does indeed have significantly more CPU power than that 4-core i7. However, for DAW use, it's almost always the case that the real-time performance dictates the overall system performance. So if that dual Xeon Beast machine has poor real-time performance, no amount of CPU power is going to make it function well as a digital audio workstation. So, what precisely is the difference between real-time performance and CPU performance? Let's start to answer that question with something that every DAW user does on a regular basis: exporting audio. Here's a typical track that uses full orchestra through VE Pro over Ethernet. It's got a few synths, a full string section, some woodwinds, full brass section, bunch of percussion, and this track will play just fine at a buffer setting of 128 samples. There you go, I'm using a Fireface with a buffer size of 128 samples. It'll play just fine with that buffer setting over the entire length of the track. So I'll start the playback here, and you can hear that indeed, no audio artifacts, no pops, no crackles. It's chugging along just fine. No issues down here in the VST performance meter. Now, let me go ahead and re-enable this limiter. And there you hear the crackles. So this limiter is pushing the computer beyond its capability to handle the audio for playback. But here's the first hint that the CPU is not the limiting factor. If you look down here at the Windows performance meter, I'm really never getting much above 50% or so. So that's telling me that my CPU is mostly just sitting around doing nothing. So it sure seems like an unlikely cause of the crackles. So here's an even better way to show that the CPU is not the limiting factor. Let's stop the playback for a second, and what I'm going to do is an audio export. So I'll pull up the export dialog box, I'll save it to some bogus file name, and what I'll also do is when the export starts is I'll start this stopwatch down here, and we'll see how long this takes. So let's start the export. Yep, I've done it once before, so let me overwrite that, and once it gets going, we'll go ahead and start the timer here. Now what I'll do at this point is I'll pause the video and then bring you back in when the export process is done. Okay, this 3-minute and 33-second track took about 2 minutes and 48 seconds to export. Now keep in mind that while I was doing this export, I had the screen capture and a separate audio capture process running in the background. So the computer's working a lot harder than it normally would have to. And without these extra burdens, it actually takes about 2 minutes and 27 seconds to export this 3-minute and 33-second track. Now let's think about this for a second. The computer can't keep up with the audio over the course of a 3.5-minute track when playing it back. However, it can process all of the exact same audio and write it to disk in significantly less than 3.5 minutes. How can that be? If the CPU is sufficiently powerful to do all of the audio processing in much less than 3.5 minutes, then if you give it 3.5 minutes, it's got more time, so playing it back should be a much easier task, right? Well, no. And the reason is that playback is a real-time process and writing to disk is a non-real-time process, and they're two very different elements of computer performance. If I were to double or triple my CPU power in this example, I might write to disk more quickly, but clearly I'm not going to impact the real-time playback because my CPU is already more than sufficiently powerful to process all of the data much faster than is required for the playback. So if you're able to export audio faster than real-time, you're probably not CPU limited. You have plenty of processing power available to do all of the audio processing much faster than is required in real time, but you can't do it in real time. Let's dig a bit deeper to understand why that is. The CPU has a number of devices for which it must provide processing power. In this example, I'm showing a hard disk, a monitor hooked up via a video card, and some USB devices. And of course, in reality, the CPU has many more devices and processes that it has to deal with, but let's use these three as an example. When one of these devices needs the CPU, it interrupts the processor with a request for processing. And while the CPU responds to this request for processing, it is locked up by the device to which it is responding. Sometimes, even if the computer has provided all the necessary processing for the device, some devices continue to lock up the CPU so that it's not able to respond to other processing requests. This is why your CPU is rarely anywhere near 100% usage. It spends a lot of time waiting for something else to happen. Now, the lockup problem has little to do with CPU power. It's determined almost entirely by the device causing the lockup, but it does determine the overall responsiveness of the system. That's the essence of the difference between real-time performance and CPU performance. You can have an infinitely powerful CPU, but if it's locked up by some device, then it can't respond to other devices, and the system will perform poorly, even though there's plenty of CPU power available. Okay, so real-time performance and CPU performance are affected by different elements of the system, and they affect the overall system performance in different ways. Why is it that real-time performance is so much more important for digital audio workstation use than, say, video editing or working on a spreadsheet? Those activities use the same system, but they don't seem to have any issues with real-time performance. Why not? The answer is in the difference in the response times required for those different activities. Unlike a video editor or spreadsheet or web browser, a digital audio workstation has to continually process data in near real time because it's taking inputs from external MIDI and audio devices and processing them on the way back out to the monitors, often while also playing back audio that was previously recorded. If you hit the keys on your MIDI keyboard and it takes 100 milliseconds for the sound to come out of the monitors, that's very disconcerting and you're going to record a bad take. In a video editor or spreadsheet, however, the user input and resulting actions are often separated by hundreds or even thousands of milliseconds with no impact on workflow. In fact, in a video editor, the user input is almost always entirely separate from the playback. You make some tweaks, then you view the playback. Then you make some more tweaks, then you view the playback. And if there's a delay of a couple hundred milliseconds from the time you finish the tweaks to the time you start the playback, you'll never notice it. Those same couple hundred milliseconds in a DAW, however, are very noticeable. And not only does it have to react faster than that couple of hundred milliseconds, it has to do so while also playing back the data that you've already recorded. In order to understand how this responsiveness is related to real-time performance, let's take a look at how audio gets from the DAW to your monitors. Your audio converter must continually provide output to your monitors, so it requires a continuous stream of digital audio data from the DAW. This audio is transferred in chunks of data at a time. The size of this chunk is called the audio buffer size and is set in your audio interface parameters. This buffer size is related to the responsiveness of the system because once the audio is moved into the buffer, it takes time to do the conversion. So there's a continual cycle of moving audio into the buffer and then waiting for the converter to produce the analog signal that is sent out to the monitors. While that conversion occurs, the next buffer must be filled. That cycle repeats over and over as the converter receives digital audio and converts it to the analog signal that goes to the monitors. Because the DAW needs to respond quickly, this buffer must be very tiny and therefore refilled very often because the DAW can fill only one buffer at a time. The smaller the buffer size, the more responsive the system. However, the smaller the buffer, the more efficient the other elements of the system must be in order to ensure that the CPU isn't locked up for too long. That's why DAW performance is much more affected by real-time performance than most other applications. The buffers for DAW use drive the system to extremely quick response times, much faster than those required for most other processing tasks. Let's bring back our other devices and see how they affect the audio buffer transfers. When the devices in the system have good real-time performance, there are no lockups that prevent the CPU from processing the audio data and filling the buffer at the required interval. So the processor is able to attend to the processing requirements for all elements of the system and keep the audio buffer filled so that there's a constant stream of audio data going to the audio converter. When a problem device locks up the CPU, however, the CPU can't fill the audio buffer, and the audio data stream has a gap in it, or worse, a garbled mess of random data. Of course, the audio converter doesn't know what's in the buffer, so it dutifully converts the garbage digital data into garbage analog data that produces garbage sound from your monitors. Those are the pops, clicks, and crackles that you hear. Sometimes, though, the computer just puts everything on pause until the buffer is filled. In that case, you hear and see a stutter. Either way, there's a break in the audio stream that you hear because the buffer wasn't filled in time. As we already demonstrated, the CPU is more than powerful enough to do all the audio processing faster than is required for real-time playback. The break in the audio stream is not because the CPU can't keep up, it's because it's locked up by some other device. So even if we were to put in a more powerful processor, we likely wouldn't see any reduction in the number of audio crackles because the CPU is not the bottleneck. Now, I say likely because it is possible that the CPU is not powerful enough to deal with the processing requirements of one of the devices, but as of about 5 to 7 years ago, that almost never happens. It's the device itself that causes the lockup, not the lack of CPU power. So what about the guy who upgrades his computer to one with a more powerful CPU and sees his audio problems go away? Well, if the only element he changed was the CPU, then in fact, yes, he probably was having CPU problems. But that's almost never the case. Most folks, when they get a new CPU, they also get at least a new motherboard and more likely an entirely new computer. Well, if you replace either one of those components, then you've got new links to the disk system, new links to the USB system, new links to the video system, new links to all of these other systems that are potential sources of real-time performance problems. So you can't say it was the CPU upgrade that improved the performance. Furthermore, lots of folks upgrade to a new computer with a more powerful processor and get worse DAW performance. If the new system has worse real-time performance than the old system, then it doesn't matter if the CPU is more powerful. It's not going to perform well as a digital audio workstation. So buyer beware, CPU benchmarks don't tell the whole story for DAW performance. You need to find somebody who's running the types of projects that you run, the right number of track counts, the same types of virtual instruments, the same types of plugins, at the same types of latencies. Only with those types of examples will you know for sure exactly how that new system is going to perform when you use it. Now let's take a look at a non-real-time process, like the audio export example, and compare it to a real-time process. There are two fundamental differences between real-time playback and non-real-time export. First, in the non-real-time export, there is no continuous audio stream. So the data can be written to disk as they become available, not according to a precisely timed interval as required by an audio interface. That allows the processor to work in the audio processing among all the other tasks it has to do. There's never a situation where it's going to miss a buffer transfer because, unlike the real-time process, the CPU has control of when the buffer transfer occurs. Second, the processor can provide however much data it wants in each chunk. So if you have a very powerful processor that can crunch a lot of data in a short period of time, then it will write to the disk a lot faster than a processor that is less powerful. In the real-time scenario, the processor can only provide a single buffer's worth of data for any given buffer period. It can't store them up for future buffer transfers. That's one of the major reasons why powerful processors are a big help for video rendering, but not so much help for DAW use. Here's an example of video rendering. As you can see, the CPU usage is extremely high, nearly 100% most of the time. Compare that to the real-time playback example at the start of this video, where the CPU usage rarely rose above 50% even though we were getting crackles in the audio. In the real-time audio example, the CPU can provide no more than one buffer of data at a time, and it must do so at a precisely defined interval. So even if the CPU is not encumbered by other devices, it can't use its processing power to fill more buffers, so it spends a lot of time just sitting around. For the non-real-time video export, however, the CPU can fill as many buffers as it wants whenever it gets the chance. So the CPU spends a lot less time waiting for something else to happen. As a result, the average CPU usage is much higher, and the rendering performance is a strong function of the CPU performance. Now, let's compare the real-time and non-real-time processes to see how they differ. We'll look at both and count the number of buffers each one transfers as time progresses. Again, the real-time process must provide precisely one buffer of data at precisely the right interval. If it gets locked up by some other process, it can't catch up by crunching more data in the next time interval. That audio train has already left the station. The non-real-time transfer, on the other hand, can provide however much data it wants at whatever interval it wants. So even though there are periods of time where it falls behind, it can catch up by crunching a lot more data at a later time. So, on average over timescales of seconds or longer, the non-real-time process can crunch a lot more audio data than the real-time process. That's why the audio export takes less time than it takes to play back the entire track. There's plenty of CPU power there to crunch all of the audio data faster than is required for that real-time playback rate. However, if the CPU can't guarantee that it will provide each chunk of data at exactly the right time, then you'll hear pops and crackles and stutters, even though on average there's significantly more CPU power there than you need. That's also why increasing the audio buffer size helps solve a lot of audio problems. You're essentially increasing the window of opportunity that the CPU has to fill that audio buffer. That gives it more time to deal with potential lockups from other devices within the system. So, for DAW use, it's the responsiveness or real-time performance that is the dominant factor in the overall system performance. Again, you can have an infinitely powerful CPU, but if it's locked into some misbehaving device or process, it can't break free to fill that audio buffer exactly when it's needed, and you'll hear pops, crackles, and stutters in your audio. As a final example, I'll show you a problem on my laptop that also clearly demonstrates a situation where the CPU is plenty powerful, but the real-time performance of the system is inhibiting audio performance. So here's a simple project running on my laptop. I've got a couple of the Cubase synths. I've got Retrolog on this first track right here, and then Spectre on the second track. And these synths are just running up and down the chromatic scale in 16th notes at 120 BPM. So the purpose of these tracks is just to produce a lot of notes and to give something the computer to play back. So let me go ahead and start the playback. Oh, let me show you first of all. So I've got this running through a Steinberg UR12 audio interface set to a buffer of 128 samples. It's connected via USB 2. So pretty standard setup. And down here in the bottom left, you see the DPC latency checker, and it's showing green across the board here. You'll notice these DPC latencies are a little bit higher than what you'll get on a typical desktop, but that's common. A laptop generally will have a higher overall DPC latency, a higher system latency than an equivalent desktop computer. And this is an i7 processor, by the way. So let me go ahead and start the playback. And you hear those synths running up and down those chromatic scales. And the computer handles this just fine. So you see here in the VST performance meter, no red overload indicators. CPU usage is relatively low, 10%, 12%, something like that. So clearly this laptop is more than sufficient to handle playback on this project. Now, here's the exact same laptop with the exact same project loaded up, but booted from a different drive. In the previous segment, I booted from the SATA SSD internal to the laptop. This time, I'm booting from the PCIe SSD, so a different drive. It's got a different connection to the processor and different real-time characteristics. And the first thing you notice are all of these red bars down here in the DPC latency checker. Red means bad, right? Yes, definitely means bad in this case. And you can see the maximum latencies are 12,000 microseconds, which is 12 milliseconds, which is very high for a system latency. However, if you look at the CPU usage after I start playback here, it's about the same, 10%, 12%, something like that. But you can see all of the VST performance spikes, and I'm not sure if you can hear the crackles in the audio because they're very subtle, but they are there. And certainly this particular playback is not functioning nearly as well as it was when I booted from the SATA SSD drive, even though this is exactly the same computer with exactly the same hardware running exactly the same project. Again, it's the exact same laptop with the exact same CPU running the exact same project. So how can there be such a dramatic difference in the performance of the system? Well, the answer is that the PCIe drive is one of those misbehaving devices that locks up the CPU and prevents it from delivering the data to the buffer when required. So there are a lot of missed buffers and a lot of garbage that gets sent out to the sound card. So it doesn't matter how powerful the CPU is, it's not being given the opportunity to fill the buffers at the required intervals, and the system performs poorly. So let's say you are getting crackles, pops, and stutters. You now have some understanding of what might be causing them, so what can you do about it? The first thing to do is check to make sure that your audio buffer size is not extremely small and that your sampling rate is not extremely high. Most audio interfaces default to buffer sizes and sampling rates that will run fine when the interface is connected straight out of the box. Maybe a buffer size of 512 and a sampling rate of 44.1 kilohertz. Those are pretty standard. However, I've found that 256 or lower gives a more natural feel when using virtual instruments. Below that, I can't tell a difference, but there are folks who like to run at even smaller buffers, so seasoned to taste. However, if you're able to run a 200-track virtual orchestra with several synths, dozens of EQs, and a few reverbs at a buffer size of 128 and a sampling rate of 44.1 kilohertz, then I'd say your system is performing about as well as anything out there. If you're working primarily with audio and have only a few virtual instruments, then you should be able to run at buffers of maybe 64 or possibly even smaller. Now, these buffer settings are assuming you're running at 44.1 or maybe 48 kilohertz. If you're one of those folks running at 96 kilohertz or even higher, your buffer settings are going to be higher. Most of the other composers I know run at 44.1 or 48 kilohertz with buffers between 128 and 256, fewer at 64 and 512, and fewer still outside of that range. If you set your buffer to 256 or maybe 512 and you're still encountering some problems, there are a few common culprits to investigate. These include video cards, audio interfaces, network interfaces, especially wireless interfaces, USB controllers, and disk controllers. These devices are, in my experience, the most common causes of DAW performance problems, not CPU. In fact, I'd say that audio cards and video cards represent more than half of the DAW performance problems that I've encountered. So a logical jumping off point for your debugging process is to make sure you've got all of the latest drivers installed for all of these devices. Go find them, download them, make sure you've got the most recent ones that are compatible with your system, and hopefully one of those will fix the problem. If the problems don't go away, try disabling devices until you find the one that's causing the problems. We're getting a bit PC specific here, so apologies to the Mac users, but a good way to figure out which device is causing problems is to disable devices and load up a latency checker like DPC Latency Checker or LatencyMon. These tools are both free, but note that DPC Latency Checker doesn't work on Windows 8 and presumably Windows 10. These tools are handy because they take the DAW software out of the picture and allow you to evaluate the performance of your hardware alone. If you load up these tools and they say you have no problems, as DPC Latency Checker is showing here, then the issue might be with your DAW software, a virtual instrument, or a plugin. If that's the case, then make sure you have the latest patches for your DAW software, and if possible, try a different DAW to see if you're having the same problem. If the latency tools do show a problem, then I recommend disabling devices one at a time, rebooting, then reloading the latency checker to see if the problem went away. If it did, you know which device caused the problem, and you can replace it. Of course, this approach doesn't work with the video card, so you have no recourse there other than to simply replace the video card. But don't forget about trying the drivers. Especially with video cards, I've found that DAW performance can be very sensitive to the particular driver you're using for your video card. And it's not always the case that the most recent driver is the best one. Sometimes you have to go back a couple of versions to find a driver that works well with your system. If none of these approaches works, then you need to dig even deeper. The next thing to try is a BIOS update. The BIOS is the basic input-output system in your computer, and it handles all of the very low-level communications among all of the devices in your system, so it can have a significant impact on real-time performance. The manner in which you do a BIOS update is very system-dependent, but it's pretty easy to find information on how to do it on the web. So just look up someone who's got a computer similar to yours, find out how they did the BIOS update. Better yet, check with the seller of your computer or check in the manuals. There's usually good information on there on how to do a BIOS update. If the BIOS update doesn't work, there's probably not much else that you can do. In the laptop example that I showed you, there's nothing that I can do to make that laptop perform well when booting from the PCIe drive. There's something about the hardware or the driver or something in there that's preventing the system from having good real-time performance. Hopefully Intel or SanDisk or HP will come up with a patch that addresses that issue and fixes my problem. Wish me luck in getting one of them to claim responsibility. In the meantime, I'm just going to have to boot from the SSD on that computer. And there are systems like that. Some systems just can't be made to perform well from a real-time standpoint. If that's the case, the only recourse you have is to either deal with it or find another system that does have good real-time performance. The good news is you've seen this video and you know that CPU benchmarks are not the best way to determine DAW performance, so you'll be a much more informed buyer. Finally, it's important to note that you might have the world's best performing hardware and still run into troubles within your DAW. The truth is that some virtual instruments and plugins are just poorly written, and the world's best performing hardware will perform poorly if coupled with poorly written software. The good news is that even the worst performing instruments and plugins that I've encountered are still perfectly workable so long as the system has decent real-time performance. They might be annoying, but they're not going to be a bottleneck in your creative process. Hopefully this video has given you some insight into the difference between real-time performance and CPU performance, and more importantly, how that relates to digital audio workstation performance. As I said in the intro, this distinction is probably the most misunderstood aspect of DAW performance. So, if you're about to get rid of your old machine, see if you can apply some of the knowledge you've gained in this video to squeeze a bit more life out of it. If it's not possible to get the performance you require out of your current machine, at least you've got some information that you can use when looking at a new machine. Remember, CPU benchmarks don't tell anywhere near the whole story when it comes to digital audio workstation performance. So, good luck in your musical endeavors, and remember to check back here for more of my videos on digital audio workstation performance.